Today we're talking about the Bible and the concept of the canon, or the biblical canon. Now, the canon of the Bible has nothing to do with these canons, or even these. But to understand the biblical canon, I first have a question to pose. What do you want to be when you grow up? Now, doubtless you've had parents, teachers, aunts, uncles, family, friends, and sometimes people don't even know that well, ask you this question. What do you want to be when you grow up? And it's not always easy to produce an answer because, well, the possibilities are nearly endless. And sometimes it can be challenging as well to explain what you want to be because generally you want to come up with an answer that will either A, seem like the right one because one day you'll be an adult. And if this is an adult question, you want to seem like you have what it takes to be one. And B, you want to produce an answer that will stop them from pestering you with further questions that you're not sure how to answer. But there is a reason why adults can't resist asking you this, because they were once in your shoes in a state of flux between childhood, dependency, domestic living, and on the way to adulthood, independence, and entering the not always boring, and not always but usually predictable world of adults. That's right. So next time an adult asks you, what do you want to be when you grow up? It's sort of like their way of saying, one day we'll welcome you to the club. But first, I want to get an idea of how ready you are to join us. Something like that. And by the way, there's no rush. Now, what does this have to do with the Bible and the canon thing? Well, lots. The Bible was once in a state of flux, and it too developed and grew up over time as the faithful were giving a deeper and deeper revelation of God. Now let's start with the Jewish Bible. The Jewish Bible often goes by the name the TaNaK. Christians will often refer to it as the Old Testament. And the best image to use when thinking of the Jewish Bible is the whole growing up thing. That's right. The TaNaK goes from childhood, adolescence, to adulthood. For example, the first section of the TaNaK is the Torah. That's where you get the TA in TaNaK from. And the Torah is reminiscent of the childhood experience. Like a child, the Torah goes by, well, a few different affectionate names. One of my daughters, for instance, is named Lucia, which her name can also be pronounced Lucia. But Typically, we call her Lou, sometimes Little Lou, other times just Lulu, or even Trouble 2, since she has a twin, Trouble 1, whom we also call the Tank, or just Paula for short. Now, the Torah, likewise, has a slew of names. It's also known as the Law of Moses, the Pentateuch. In a broader sense, it's known as the Way, or the hand pointing the way. And if you really want a long name, it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It has yet other names in Hebrew, but those are the common ones in English. And the Torah provides all the basics, the building blocks that you need to survive. It's all the things you learn as a child. It answers those questions that kids like to ask, such as, how did the world get here and why are we here? For the Jewish people, it also explains where Israel comes from and key figures like Abraham and Sarah and how their faith works. The Torah also provides a crucial guide for figuring out right from wrong. Now, for kids, it can sometimes be around the age 2 when they realize they can't actually bend the entire world to their will, hence the terrible twos. They also have to learn how to get along with others and do so in a manner that is fair and just. Now, thankfully, we have an inbuilt sense of justice. Grade 3ers are a prime example of this. Anyone who steps out of line, breaks the rules, or does anything that seems remotely unjust, well, the teacher's going to hear about it a minute later. As we mature, more or less, we figure most of this out. Now, I know some teachers who say to their grade 8 class, okay, I'll give you a few minutes, get in groups, and come up with a list of rules that people should abide by in life. And they'll say things like, don't steal other people's stuff, don't cheat, don't post pictures of others without their permission, don't try and steal someone else's girlfriend or boyfriend, and so on. Lists like these are actually quite profound, since they give us a sense of what lines we shouldn't cross. And they're usually given because we know the consequences of when people do cross them. Well, the Torah has something similar. It's called the 10 Commandments. These basic guidelines begin with a preface for Israel's relationship with the Lord. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. You shall have no other gods besides me, or before me. It can be translated as well. In other words, you and I, Israel, are in a covenantal relationship, says the Lord. So there isn't any room for any other gods in here. And some other commandments sound a lot like that list from the grade 8 class. Don't steal other people's stuff. Don't lie. Don't cheat on your spouse. Don't covet other people's partners and their possessions, and so on. So the Torah sets out the basics for life. It gives the people of Israel a foundation for understanding where they came from, why they are here, and gives clear guidelines of how to behave, figuring out right from wrong. All right, well, after the Torah and the TaNaK is the Nevi'him, or what we call the prophets. And this is like Israel's adolescent phase. All that stuff they already learned, all those rules they knew about not worshiping false gods, to not taking advantage of the poor, the widow, the orphan, and all those things about right behavior, those are kind of, sort of, well, maybe completely forgotten about. So if the Torah is the hand pointing the way forward, the prophets are the opposite. They're pointing back to the Torah, back to all the important things you knew and have forgotten about. Now, often in English, we think of the prophets as foretelling the future, but this is a minor function or a minor role that the prophets have. They are primarily the mouthpieces of God. So first and foremost, they are God's spokespersons. The prophets are highly creative and loud, because that's just what adolescents need to understand something. So Ezekiel's a best example of this. He cuts his hair, he slices it with his sword, he plays with little action figures, he even packs his bags as if he's going on exile with his suitcase and walks around town with it. He eats the most bizarre foods, and he does all of this to illustrate a message to the people around him. Again, the aim of the prophets is to allow people to see everything they already knew in a new light, and to grasp it, appropriate it in a more mature fashion as they figure out how independence and freedom and all those other things that the adult world promises will also be bewildering, enthralling, heartbreaking, and downright dangerous, if not deadly. So the prophets point back to the law. What comes next in the TaNaK is the Ketuvim, also known as the writings. Now these include both historical books like 1st and 2nd Kings and Ruth, which explain the history of Israel, but they also contain wisdom books like Proverbs, the Psalms, Job, Ecclesiastes, and the Wisdom of Solomon, and so on. The writings are like adulthood. Adults tend to get really interested in their family histories, family trees, lineages, and so forth. And they want to know, well, more about their forebears, where they come from, or where they came from, their struggles that they endured, and so on. Well, that's the role of the historical books. They give Israel's long and complex history of exile and return. And as adults mature further, they are more receptive and appreciative of wise advice. They have tons of experience behind them and are generally settled down, so these books of wisdom are pearls for good living. The wisdom books also allow for introspection and challenge the adult to take life to the next level, because they open up insight on what things like prudence and judiciousness entail, and how to be virtuous. What are tips on raising your children, how to get along with other adults. So this is an overview of the Jewish Bible in a nutshell, in terms of development. Now, but what does that have to do with the canon? Well, the canon, the word canon comes from measuring stick. It means a ruler. And if a book in ancient Israel measured up, it was allowed into the biblical canon. Now, as noted, each section of the Jewish Bible plays a particular function, such as giving us a grasp of right from wrong, like the Torah, pointing us back to everything we ever learned, the prophets, and finally giving us wisdom and a sense of history, the writings. So those books of Israel, which were deemed inspired by the Holy Spirit and suitable to that particular part of the canon, were admitted into the Bible. In short, if they measured up, which is another way of saying if they met the canon, then they were adopted into the Bible. Now, in the following, we'll say a bit more about the New Testament and how the biblical canon functions in Christianity.